levels of vegetation, you might talk about grasses and trees, that sort of thing. All of these are sort of mediating these processes as they interact over time. So let's think about using this to redefine sustainability. We know that annual production can exceed what is needed for reproduction. This is a fairly common attribute of systems. In some respects, this is just a vegetational translation of Malthus's observation that there is sort of an overproduction of propagules, humans. There's more than is needed to sustain the sort of current population over time. Therefore, some portion of above-ground net primary production, ANPP, can be sustainably harvested. This amount, however, is variable. It's highly variable. We've talked about coefficients of variation. In some systems, it's much higher than in others. And we might loosely define resilience as the ability to recover from a disturbance. And this is a term that is now in wide use among ecologists and other people. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment includes a lot of people who would count themselves among fans of the idea of resilience. One of the things that they're trying to get at is to fight against the Clementsian legacy, the assumption from Clements that systems will always respond linearly and recover in a predictable fashion from any disturbance and return eventually to their original or climax condition. In other words, people are now asking about thresholds, points where change becomes nonlinear and or irreversible, at least irreversible on human timescales. These are points at which resilience is exceeded. Processes then break down or are rearranged. And here's a list of some of the ways in which we might specify a process that breaks down through inbreeding or fire suppression, accelerated erosion, habitat alterations, changes that do not result afterwards in a simple return to the previous condition. So if we view all this together and redefine sustainability as the harvesting of products from a system and the discarding of waste into a system without exceeding critical thresholds, that is, without surpassing the resilience of the system as defined by the interacting processes that generate the products and absorb the wastes. Now, I will grant you that this is not necessarily getting us over the problem of post hoc or retrospective definitions. It is, however, providing us with something more specific to look at when it comes to evaluating the sustainability of a system. We can try to identify what those limits are within which you can harvest surplus product and discard waste without pushing a system out of its sort of characteristic condition. And this, I believe, is a little bit more useful than, for instance, the definition offered in some of the Daly and Costanza articles, in which it's simply total natural capital, for example. Okay, I'm going well, I feel like I'm going too fast, but I'm probably not going fast enough because we're only on slide number 30. And I'm trying to go quickly here. We'll see if it works. It's already 10 after 1. Okay, so let's talk about Worcester. Well, are there questions or feedback, comments? I barely have time for them today, but I'm going to try to make sure we have time for a break, but it'll probably be short. All right, I'm going to keep going then. The Dust Bowl. What made it unsustainable? The narrative here is fairly simple, and Worcester does a nice job of laying it out. Sod busting, the plowing up of prairie sod and grasses to turn it into wheat fields, was done without anticipation of droughts, without an understanding and expectation of the temporal variability in rainfall. In other words, you go out there, you bust up a bunch of sod, you plant a wheat crop, it works out really well for a year or two, you think, great, you keep busting up more sod, planting more wheat, and then eventually a year comes along in which there's not enough rain, and the wheat dies. And the soil is left exposed, it no longer has the sod to protect it, and you discover, too late, that this is not a system that can reliably grow wheat, at least not without irrigation. But it's also important to recognize that this wasn't just a temporal problem, this was a spatial problem. In other words, it wasn't just that somebody busted sod here or there, it's that so many people busted sod virtually everywhere at the same time. Those enormous clouds of dust blowing across the Great Plains, which eventually reached as far as the Atlantic Ocean, were not the result of a few isolated places being busted up. They were the result of vast areas, millions of acres, simultaneously being exposed to these drought effects and causing nonlinear responses in the soil, right, in its relationship to climate and particularly storms, right? So the spatial homogeneity of sod busting enabled the nonlinear responses in soil and climate. Why did this happen? There are a variety of sort of simple proximate causes that we could look at. Ignorance of the system. The people moving into this area were not familiar with it. Their expectations had been formed further east where there was more rainfall, and they were simply moving forward, perhaps not aware of the fact that they were getting into drier and drier areas. Faulty expectations of climatic uniformity. They figured if it rains in Iowa, it'll rain in Oklahoma. There were also issues of underlying patterns of land ownership related to the land disposal laws of the time and also to credit relationships, the way in which if you owned a piece of land, you could use it to borrow money from a bank to buy the things you needed to buy in order to get a wheat farm up and running. There was also, obviously, the availability of a technology, tractors in this case, that imposed certain spatial and temporal scales of production, and Worcester talks about this, right? I'll get back to that in a moment. So we need to figure out how to bring these social processes into some kind of constructive relationship with the more ecological ones that we've discussed so far. These, I think, can also be understood in terms of spatial and temporal scales, and that may give us a kind of common ground in which to integrate them, on which to integrate them. We must somehow account for human action, how it produces and reflects meanings, representations, ideas, intentions, etc. What motivates people to do the things that they do. And this is really what Worcester is hoping to explain. So he says, the American plainsmen were as intelligent as the farmers of any part of the world. They were by no means the first to overrun the limits of their environment, but the reason they did so must be explained not by that vague entity, human nature, but rather by the peculiar culture that shaped their values and actions. It was culture in the main that created the Dust Bowl. This is from the very end of the reading I asked you to do, and in many ways, this is Worcester's thesis. That to understand the Dust Bowl, you have to understand the culture of the people who were out there doing the sod busting and the farm. They understood land merely as a means to make money, he says. They were victims of or participants in mass culture, a term that isn't thrown around nearly as widely now as it was back in the 70s when Worcester wrote his book. But in this case, he's describing them in terms of farmers who farmed in order to buy goods from urban industrial America. He focuses on this, if not in the reading that I asked you to do, then later on, that a lot of these farmers, this was also the time when Sears Roebuck was a new and exciting phenomenon. And the fact that you could live in Oklahoma and page through a catalog from Sears Roebuck and order all of the goods produced in Chicago and New York and the industrial East and have them delivered to you on the train, and thereby create a household of goods that was very similar to the goods available to anyone else in the United States, was a really novel and exciting thing. And he emphasizes this. This was not a locally oriented production system. This was oriented towards a national economy. The wheat that was being grown was all being put on trains and sent back the other direction, and in many ways was being sent in exchange for the goods being sent from Sears Roebuck. It overrode considerations of local ecology. Farmers, as a result, chose to bust sod on an enormous scale. And these are the things that Worcester suggests are the culture that drove the Dust Bowl. Where does this Dust Bowl culture come from? He discusses this as well. The Jeffersonian expansionary democracy of sort of American lore and history, plus the shaping of American agriculture by an evolving capitalism. And here he talks about the myth of the yeoman farmer, the idea that America is the sort of heart and soul of America is this independent family-scale farmer who owns his own land. And this distinguished America in an important way from Europe and feudalism. They farm on a family scale. They are equals in a sort of local democracy, united by community interests and rural virtues. And this may sound like it's an antiquated or dated idea of the sort of heart and soul of America, but it had an extremely persistent and important influence on American popular self-understanding and political self-understanding for a very long time. This Jeffersonian democracy rested very heavily on two things, both of them acts of the federal government, the Cadastral Survey and the Homestead Act. What is a cadastral survey? Anybody know? Jefferson directed the government, upon acquisition of the Louisiana Purchase, to send out teams of surveyors to survey the vast interior of North America, which he had just purchased from the French. And what they did was they went across the countryside, essentially laying down the lines that now define the fields that you can see when you fly over the Midwest. This was a grid of straight horizontal and vertical lines, or perhaps I should just say latitudinal and longitudinal lines. Not quite. There are some problems, obviously, because longitudinal lines are not perfectly parallel, so you have to correct for that every once in a while. But for the most part, it laid the world out into these squares of 1 square mile apiece, which could then be subdivided. How many acres in a square mile? Anybody know? 640 acres in a square mile. So you divide it into quarters, and each one is 160 acres. And that's how much you were entitled under the Homestead Act from 1862 to homestead. If you went out and found an unclaimed quarter section, that is a quarter of 1 square mile, 160 acres, and you set it up with a house, and you started farming, and you resided there for a period of years, you were entitled to basically go to the government and petition to become the owner of that land for a nominal fee or no fee, depending on the time and place you were doing this. And this was intended to create conditions for the emergence of these yeoman farmers, small-scale farmers who own their own land. This model, however, which worked reasonably well in places that got more rainfall, broke down on the arid and semi-arid plains, which Wallace Stegner famously characterized as beyond the 100th meridian, which is the 100th line of latitude, or longitude, which is also approximately where the average annual rainfall drops below 20 inches, which means you are now in a semi-arid condition. If you get less than 10 inches, you're in an arid condition. Roughly less than 20 inches of rain a year means you're not going to be able to farm annual crops reliably without irrigation. And this yeoman farmer Jeffersonian Homestead Act system is now famously understood by historians as having failed beyond the 100th meridian. John Wesley Powell, who worked for the federal government, sort of ruined his own career in writing and disseminating a famous report in 1878 in which he said, this system is not going to work in the drier parts of North America. We need a completely different system, one that was more communal, involved collective ownership of the drier, expansive lands, that sort of thing. It was considered heresy for him to make these suggestions, and he got transferred to a much less significant department. Wallace Stegner's famous book, Beyond the 100th Meridian, details this story and is well worth reading if you get a chance. So, there is no God west of Salina. Anybody know where Salina is? Yes, it's in the Midwest. Where in the Midwest? Anyone been there? Anyone heard of? It's in Kansas. It's in east central Kansas. What's that? You guessed. Well, you guessed correctly. It's also the home of some very interesting research at a place called the Land Institute that has been trying for about 20 years, 25 years to figure out how to farm the Midwest with perennial crops instead of annual crops. Wes Jackson is the head of that effort and is quite a prominent figure in alternative agriculture. In any case, Salina is about on the 100th meridian, and west of there's not enough rainfall, and there is therefore no God. This is a famous line from the Dust Bowl era. You see here pictures of the sort of yeoman farmer as romanticized, but also obviously with a hint of hardscrabble sufferation. Virgin Land is a very famous book by Henry Nash Smith, American historian, who described and discussed the importance of the myth of the yeoman farmer colonizing or utilizing virgin land, unclaimed, untended, unowned land, to build the kind of Jeffersonian democracy that I was talking about a second ago. This all went very badly during the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression. There are some very famous photographs. This one by Dorothea Lange. This one may as well be by Dorothea Lange. She was hired by the Works Progress Administration, the New Deal, to take pictures of what was going on. And many of these pictures had a searing effect on American consciousness and awareness of the circumstances going on in the Dust Bowl at the time. In other words, this yeoman farmer myth was obviously failing in its effort to work in this time and place. And what you see, if you then study the sort of popular culture that arose to take over from the yeoman farmer, is the emergence of this myth of the cowboy instead, where you have gunslingers and guys on horseback and John Wayne and that sort of thing. This is sort of a side story. Worcester doesn't take it up, but I think it's worth mentioning because in terms of American ideologies of settlement and the West, this is clearly sort of fills the vacuum created by the collapse of the earlier Jeffersonian myth. So, the capitalist ethos was by far the more important, says Worcester, for it replaced man's attachment to the earth, which Jefferson still cherished, with an all-out dedication to cash. It replaced a rural economy aimed at sufficiency with one driving toward unlimited wealth. It was, he says, about farming for money, farming oriented towards exchange value in Marx's terms, and other considerations are subordinated. And as Marx points out, any system oriented towards exchange value is intrinsically insatiable or infinite. But this was not new in the 1920s. This kind of spirit of farming for exchange value was quite old already on the frontier of Western American capitalism by this point in time. So I'm not certain it really works in and of itself as an explanation for the Dust Bowl. There had been important changes, which Worcester describes, since the 1890s, which had seen an earlier wave of settlement on the southern Great Plains. The Homestead Act in 1909 was enlarged to allow people to claim 320 acres instead of 160, so half a section of land rather than a quarter section of land. This was specifically aimed at enabling people to settle these drier areas where it might require more land to grow a sufficient crop to support a family. And this sparked a renewed land rush in the early part of the 20th century. This is a picture of people lining up outside the land office to file their claims and get started going after these larger pieces of land. There were also technologies that came along in this period of time. Worcester discusses them. The disc plow, the tractor, farm trucks, combines. Here's an early tractor, this one powered by steam, that enabled people to pull plows heavy enough and deep enough to pull up and bust the sod in areas where it was too thick and too strong using livestock or smaller tractors. These were, in turn, related to the boom in Chicago, specifically Chicago, but also more generally. In other words, the advent of mass production of tractors, internal combustion engines, with the power to do this, but cheap enough to be afforded by small-scale farmers. And this dynamic is very much connected to what's going on in places like Chicago at this time. Here you see a demonstration of some of these new technologies, the prairie grass being turned into neatly furrowed, plowed land with these new tools. You see, in other words, a decreased organic composition of capital. It's the bigger tractor phenomenon we talked about before, which leads to a cycle of debt and expansion. Tractors make larger scale production both possible, in the sense that with a bigger tractor you can plow more land. One farmer can plant and harvest a larger area of ground, but it also makes it necessary because the debt you incur to buy the tractor means that you have to grow more crops in order to pay off the loans. And this has a rather conundrum-like effect in the sense that if you get good rainfall and you grow a lot of crops, you typically see the collapse of prices because everyone has done well and grown a lot of crops, and you get an oversupply of whatever that crop is, and prices collapse, and you find yourself struggling to pay off your debts. On the other hand, if it doesn't rain and you suffer a drought, you simply don't have any crops, and you, again, perhaps run the risk of defaulting on your payments. Change this word in your notes, please. That should say decrease, not increase right there. There were some other factors that Worcester also describes. Suitcase farmers. A third of the farms and 2/3 of the land in Haskell County, which is one of his sites for this study, were absentee-owned. People who were taking advantage of the boom in wheat farming, busting open new land, and then simply going back to their day job in the city and coming back in time to harvest the crop and cash in on the results. This led to a much greater amount of land plowed leading up to the Dust Bowl, 33 million acres, or 1/3 of the region, in 1935. And this obviously has a lot to do with the nonlinear effects of those storms during the Dust Bowl. All right, 2 minutes. Well, 3 minutes break, because I need to calm my voice. Okay. So at places, Worcester seems to attribute the Dust Bowl to these technological advances. He says the machine made possible in common an exploitative relationship with the earth, a bond that was strictly commercial, so that the land became nothing more than a form of capital that must be made to pay as much as possible. There are, however, larger scale linkages that are also important. He himself describes these. Imported varieties of winter wheat. We will talk more about this in connection with Clottenburg on Thursday. In any event, what it meant was that there were new strains of wheat that were better adapted to the conditions in the southern Great Plains and enabled greater production. World War I and its aftermath had a strong effect on this as well. The Turkish blockade of Russian wheat exports created a shortage in world markets, which drove prices up and made it even more lucrative to plant wheat in the high plains. This carried into the early 20s. An aggressive expansion was also encouraged by nationalism and government price supports. There was then a recession, actually, in the 1920s, but this only motivated further capitalization as some farmers went out of business and existing farmers got bigger and needed still larger and more expensive tractors and that sort of thing. This is all, you can see this if you watch the movie version of The Grapes of Wrath, right? So how do we explain this culture, which Worcester suggests ultimately is what drove the Dust Bowl? He characterizes it as the opposite of a sense of place, which he describes as a perception of what makes a piece of land function as it does, and a feeling of belonging to and sharing in its uniqueness, a complex adaptiveness in which the self reflects the community and the community reflects the natural system. So by that notion, you might suggest that the scale of the social system, the fact that it was national and international in its scale, in its inputs and its marketing, didn't match the local conditions of the ecosystem in which people were farming. You might suggest that the ecological system needed a social system that was more self-contained or autarkic, right? More aimed towards production for local consumption. The problem with that formulation is that the farmers wouldn't even have been there at all under such a constraint. There's no way that they, given the tools and the agricultural practices and consumption expectations that they had, they wouldn't have been there if they didn't have access to outside markets, even just for things like building materials, let alone for tractors. He talks about rootlessness and rootedness. He points out that the farmers who came through in the 1890s had no intention in the first place of staying. They were there simply to settle, colonize, come to own, and then sell land that they were ready to move on going further west. Those who survived the Dust Bowl, he says, did stick around. They didn't have anywhere further to go. Of course, many people actually did leave, and they came out here, and this is how we got the famous story of the Grapes of Wrath and Okies, migrants escaping the Dust Bowl. But what happened next? Did a sense of place develop in the Great Plains after the Dust Bowl? What happened? And this gets into the part of the book that I didn't ask you to read, but I want to try to summarize it anyway. It gets into this question of the state, the Dust Bowl, and specifically the welfare state.